What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of Real Talks with Jakub, where I interview doers, achievers, and go-getters, and how they created their own luck and became successful. And today we are here with Christopher Bramley. And Chris is a speaker, consultant, expert on learning and teaching and decision making. And he also knows a thing or two about different frameworks and models, including Cynefin, complexity, agile, lean frameworks, and so on. And he operates globally, speaks at meetups and conventions, and also runs single classes, workshops, and full courses. He's deeply passionate about helping people and organizations learn to transform themselves. He works with startups, SMBs, global enterprises, or even civil clients who usually approach him when they need to enhance management, innovate more, disrupt their current processes, or communicate better. And in this episode, we'll discuss a topic I'm very passionate about, which is learning and teaching. So welcome to the show, Chris.
Hi, thanks.
So Chris, why don't you start by telling me a little bit more about your journey? When and how has it all started?
So, well, my LinkedIn bio kind of says, for 42 years, I've been kind of learning how to learn and so on. And I guess a lot of what piqued my interest with learning and how humans learn and how we don't necessarily learn the right way and stuff happened actually when I was at school, funnily enough, where, looking back at it and looking at statistics and how we learn and having researched a lot of this, not very many people actually learn very well the way that you're taught in school. And I certainly didn't. I've always been what is very often referred to as a heretic or a maverick or an outlier. Like I think differently, I process differently. I just didn't fit into how stuff worked. So,
and it's not very welcome, right? In the school system.
No, schools are as bureaucratic, unfortunately,
Yes.
especially a private school where I went, are as bureaucratic as any company or government or whatever, right? So academia is very bureaucratic. So I didn't fit in particularly well in a number of ways. I was always a bit different anyway, and there are always kids like that. But a lot of people don't get to learn properly. So I kind of got pushed to the side a bit, or I ended up in like kind of the low sets and stuff. And it was kind of weird. Like I ended up in the C set for English, which was the low set, when I had a reading age of 21 when I was 12. So it doesn't necessarily fit to the individual learning. And so I had problems with learning my whole life because I have to be properly engaged to learn, as many people do. Now, some people can just academically sit down and go, blah, 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 and remember, but that's not the same as comprehension. So all of this stuff started really interesting me. And as I kind of went through my career, I moved into DevOps and computers because I'm fairly logical and, I went through all of that.
Yes.
And I'm pretty good with that stuff. And then I moved through pretty much everything in DevOps and computing, except for coding, which I love the idea. I love what you get out of it, right? The outcomes you get. But debugging 6 million lines of code just didn't really hold a lot of interest for me. So I ended up doing pre-sales and consultancy and implementation and stuff like that. And then I moved into teaching and training. So I ended up teaching, having to teach in like 4 days, make these people an expert in 4 days. This is a typical IT thing. People from Fujitsu or IBM or SunGard or, really big companies, but also very small companies. And I realized that a lot of the things that I'd researched and picked up over the years had a lot of importance to what I was doing. And I started teaching people how I wished I'd been taught. And I started getting, now I don't know if you've ever done any computer like training or IT training, but it's generally considered to be quite boring, right?
So we are going back to that engagement, right? Which you were missing.
It's engagement, right? It's engagement. Well, if you go to a typical IT, it doesn't have to be IT training. Think of any company saying, okay, we're going to do some onboarding for fire safety today. And people are like, okay, and you're just ticking a checkbox or whatever. And nobody really cares.
You'll just sit through and okay, done.
Yeah.
And you just leave.
Okay, now you've certified that you've done this.
Yes.
Like, what does that even mean? Right. And that kind of led me on to this whole thing about qualifications. Actually, qualifications are good in a number of ways, but they're also bullshit in a number of ways, like quite considerably. And I came to a realization a long time ago that if you if you get a qualification, that should be the beginning of learning, not the
Yes.
end. And people consider it to be the end point of learning. And it's actually a waypoint on a journey, because technically you never stop learning, right? That learning is what humans do best. Like I mentioned this in, in my TEDx talk, when I was talking about how we learn to collaborate and how we use narrative to learn and discuss things and whatever, right? We learn from the beginning. So I started researching how we learn, how we engage, how I think people should be taught based on how I would like to be taught. But then I realized that there were issues in terms of the fact that everyone's different. And probably when you look back at school, or you look at industry, or you look at whatever, you realize that nobody cares how different people are. This is how it's done. This is how it's taught. Fit into it.
Exactly. That reminds me a picture I saw. There was there was a fish, there was a horse, there was a monkey, and there was a dog, and there was a tree.
I know the one,
and
yeah.
the teacher was saying, "Climb that tree," right? So that's how actually schools approach teaching right now.
Yeah.
They don't really see the differences. They just have a framework, and everybody should fit into the framework. Do you think that this is like the most, like the biggest issue when it comes to current education system?
I think that it is a big issue, but it does depend on which country you're talking about, because this is also cultural. Curriculums are usually set by governments.
Okay.
Right. So this also does come back to how the government's interfacing with this. So, for example, when you look at places like Finland and a lot of other Scandinavian countries, you have this idea where children shouldn't have to be forced to do homework and shouldn't have to, fit into this rigid bureaucracy of academia kind of thing as kids who should be learning and playing and whatever. And so teachers and children are encouraged to go and research and learn things on their own. And it's very successful, and they're very happy, and they're very productive, and it works. So there's a myth, it's a lie, essentially, that's been propagated from time immemorial. And this goes back to Taylorism and bureaucracy and, any kind of structure that humans have created over the years. And that is that people need guidance from hierarchy to actually be able to achieve anything. Otherwise, it's chaos. And we know that that isn't true. In fact, there was a study done with road safety by Hans Monderman, showing that when you remove bureaucracy on the road, people actually drive more safely, more politely, and more efficiently, right? It's not just chaos.
Well,
that's very interesting, really cool.
That's interesting, because I've been to Bali a couple months back, and I was driving there in the streets.
Asia is crazy.
It is crazy, but I'm not kidding. I've never felt more safe.
It works, yeah.
It's so interesting. It's like a living organism, like directly in the streets, and people just crossing each other, and it's so interesting to see that there are actually not many like car accidents or accidents in general.
No, it's the same in the Philippines. It's the same in a lot of Asia. So what you're looking at there is a very interesting cultural difference as well. Number one, they're more comfortable being closer to each other because there's a cultural difference there. But number two, in Europe and in the West, we use horns as an expression of anger, and in Asia, they use a horn as an expression of "don't bump into me, I'm here." So, like last time I was in India, it was just non-stop beeping and people turning around in the middle of the road and whatever. But nobody's really shouting because everyone's doing it.
Yes.
Right? Here, you've got this sense of entitlement. How dare you park on my driveway to pick your kids up in your Range Rover or whatever it is, but I'm going to cut you up at the lights because I deserve to. And you're just like, this isn't a road meritocracy. We're all here, So it is interesting. There are definitely cultural differences in how we think about things and do things. So sorry if you can hear that. That's my coffee machine turning off. That's very interesting. And then I'm trying to remember where we were going now. We went off on this
Scandinavian education.
Scandinavian countries, yes. So basically, when you look at the West, like the UK, for example, we now have these SATs, which are scores determining how good the children are with their knowledge.
Yes.
Right? This doesn't mean applicable knowledge. At 4 years old, you do not have a vast sum of applicable knowledge that you've learned at school. It's just not a thing. And SATs are something we force 4-year-olds now to sit, which are intensely stressful. They have to, achieve certain marks, and it's, it's scorekeeping, and it's ridiculous. It is absolutely ridiculous. So it does depend on the country and how things are set up.
Who creates these systems? I mean, it's just a common sense that if you approach like a 4-year-old kid and you force him to have some grades, some marks, that it won't probably work out in the long run. Who creates these like old school systems?
Disassociated people in the government who haven't ever probably had to deal with this. There is a disturbing trend. In fact, I met a very old friend last night in London who is, I think he was a research fellow at Cambridge, and now he teaches at City University, and he's, he lectures on politics and all the stuff that's happened recently. And he was saying to me, he was agreeing because I was talking about statistics. And when you look at Ivy League schools in the US, there's basically no difference between eventual grades. What you get as a difference is networking, right, and opportunity. That's the difference by going to expensive schools or whatever. So you go to Oxbridge or whatever it is, you're looking at opportunities. You go to Eton or whatever it is, you're looking at opportunities rather than kids who went to the local state school kind of thing. So.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I've had a discussion about like whether education and whether universities are still relevant, because so many companies are actually not requiring degrees. They actually require certain skill sets. But you said a really interesting point that these universities and communities there create then opportunities to land better jobs, to create better businesses and so on.
Yeah, and actually they are still relevant and they are still required. I mean, I remember I looked at Shell's website a while back because my skill set fits into a number of different areas for coaching and consulting. And I was looking to approach them because I'm very much into sustainability in terms of social sustainability, economic sustainability, and environmental sustainability. This is obviously becoming a large part of what companies are moving towards. So this is something based in cultural shift, which is what I use teaching and learning and complexity theory for, and it all kind of fits together. And I never went to university. I managed to get thrown out of art college for not doing enough work, which is quite an achievement. I thought that was the point of art college. And I couldn't even get past the first piece of applying because I didn't have a degree. And it doesn't matter what degree you have. Some companies still require you to have any degree as long as it's a degree. So it's a mark of having been through the system, which can be beneficial, but it's also a mark saying you have been conditioned in a specific way to think in a certain way. Now, what I find very interesting about how university has changed in the UK, and I think in the US as well, is that we don't teach critical thinking skills particularly well. Now, some countries may, we don't necessarily in the West. And it's to the advantage of a lot of governments, especially these days, to have a very highly skilled subset of people who understand some quite complex scenarios, but who don't apply critical thinking, because it basically makes people easier to control. And I'm not suggesting there's a vast government conspiracy, right? But it is a fact. If people can't make an informed decision, but they're very skilled at doing work, you have a relatively obedient workforce who can do stuff you need done. So.
It almost sounds like that there's some secret society controlling what people.
Yeah, I don't think it's quite that bad, but I'm sure there are elements of that, in there, because there always are, right? The whole point of bureaucracy is command and control. And one of the main, so that we discussed this last night, I talk about this to companies all the time. One of the main things I do is help companies, where appropriate, break down bureaucracy, which is extremely rigid, and introduce more of an ecosystem, self-organizing approach where you're reactive and you can adapt and you can accept and you can be much more efficient and human in how you deliver things. And that's a really important thing. But a bureaucracy is political, and it's all about maintaining its own structure, not the outcome that you get from the bureaucracy. Okay. So it's quite interesting.
So how do you do it? You come to the company which is really tied up in all the paperwork or the bureaucracy, that ideas are not flowing, people are not teaching, and they're really just going there with a school mindset of not doing mistakes and so on. So how do you change it? Because I think it's not just here is like set of rules you need to follow. It's more like a mindset shift these people need to go through to actually achieve that.
It's an entire paradigm shift. Exactly. Yes. Right. So this is one of those questions that people ask me, and I'm like, okay, this is not a particularly easy answer because, okay, the way I put it is this. There are too many consultants out there who rely on a cargo cult cookie cutter approach, and you get this with management fads. I changed this thing in my company and then I've written a book and then I go on shows and people are like, I'm going to do that because that's what I want to happen.
Yes.
Now you can't innovate if somebody has already innovated. It's like Amazon did what Amazon did and suddenly everyone started doing what Amazon was doing. And I was like, well, you're not going to do Amazon. Amazon's been done. You're not going to achieve the success that Amazon did because they've done it, right? It's innovated. And it's the same kind of thing. So everything has to be in context. So when you implement things, when I go into a company and speak to them, the first thing I do is gather context because I have to understand where they are at this point in time. Because if I do something for whatever, if I went and did something with Amazon and then I went to Google, I can't do what I did at Amazon because they're Google, right? It is literally totally different history, totally different people, totally different structure, totally different context. So you have to gather that context first. And then you have to look at the culture and then you have to look at where you can change it. Now, this is where we get into complexity theory a little bit. Complexity is dispositional, right? What that means, and people are complex, right? What that means is you can't predict people. You can guess what they might do, but you can't predict it. There's no causality. Okay, so you can look at it and say, well, this might work. We're going to have to investigate this. We're going to have to test it, do some experiments. And that's how you kind of have to do it. So when you mentioned Cynefin, there are a number of ways Cynefin does this. And one of them is to use context-free stories or narratives to discover where everyone is. And I won't go into too much detail because it gets a little complicated and complex.
When you were saying everyone is, I mean, if you go to the company with just like thousands of employees, who you work usually with the top management to understand like.
Actually, interesting. It's a very interesting question because people would assume it would just be top management or a specific level. And actually, yes, that's where you have to interface because if culture is defined within a company by the actions and inactions of leadership. And people always forget that second part, which is really important. If a leader says, I want this company to be agile, and then continues to act in a very unagile way, the company will not become agile, whatever they say, right? That's just how it works. And that's something, in Cynefin, you have these ideas of constraints, which can be bounding or they can be connecting. And this is what Dave Snowden, who created Cynefin, calls a dark constraint, which I love, right? Like dark energy. So in a company, I'm sure you've seen this, you go in and you say, what about that thing there? And they say, we don't talk about that. And you're like, well, why not? And they're like, we just don't. So it's nothing to do with company policy, but it's a cultural, we don't do that kind of thing, right? And that's a dark constraint. So you then have to start working out where all these things lie, how culture works within the company. And that's where you have this thing called ethnography, which is very important to teaching. And it's the understanding of, hopefully to a deep and broad level, of a different culture. And we'll come back to that, I guess, when we talk a little bit more about teaching and learning in a bit. But the important thing here is companies, it's not just countries that have different culture and cultural identity. Company culture, we know, is a thing, but people often don't realize you also have intra-company culture between departments. Think about marketing versus engineering, right? And how many, or sales versus engineering, or whatever. And specific types of people are usually drawn to types of roles. So you have interpersonal cultural clashes, you have interdepartmental cultural clashes. So you have to find ways of enabling collaboration deep within the company. Like all of this stuff, I keep saying all this stuff is linked because it is, right? Now, the idea with a complex system, companies love to break things down and say, let's just change marketing first. In any complex system, you remember the myth of the butterfly that flaps its wings and a hurricane goes around the world, right? In a complex system, anything that you change changes everything else. You can't just change one thing and not have it affect it. And the best example of this, if you take medication, there are side effects and they're different for everyone. Right? You don't just change whatever it is here, it has other effects.
So you mentioned, I just want to summarize, I think, what you were saying. Go first, you need to understand where the company is to understand the culture. Then there's a complexity where you need to understand all these things that are not maybe discussed properly
Yeah,
between departments and so on. And I want to know, you mentioned that it's a complex mechanism like
yeah,
sales, marketing, engineering, and that they should be linked, they should be connected. So when it comes to
absolutely.
connecting and streamlining the communication between different departments, who should be actually in charge of that? How should it be done? Who should be that bridge that will link everything together?
It's a really good question. And the answer is essentially leadership, right? So,
Uh-huh.
because culture is defined by leadership and the actions and inactions, they are the ones who have to drive cultural change within the company.
Mm-hmm.
However, having said that, culture is made from or created by the interconnections and interactions between people and departments. So you've kind of got this effect where it must be driven from the top down, but it has to spread from the bottom up.
Mm-hmm.
So it is literally a company-wide paradigm shift. And that's where companies don't really get it, because they love niche things. They love modularizing. They
Yes.
love, snapshotting little bits and reductionism and summaries and that kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing. Um, they don't like looking at things in a holistic fashion. And
Mm-hmm.
for something like culture, you really have to think about it
Mm-hmm.
holistically.
Mm-hmm. So the actionable step here would be to just have meetings with people from different departments. That would be maybe like the first things what could be done.
That's a good step. You can do a number of things to do. So I've been recently talking to one of my clients about, and they've got a really good culture, but they still have various divides within their company, because you're never going to get rid of these things, because humans are tribal and we just
Mm-hmm.
form tribes and we're a pain with it. So that's something you have to learn how to manage and work with. Um, but you can use things like championing, for example. So you can actually take somebody from the sales team and put them in to, a few times a month or once a week or whatever it is, or get them to work actually half in and out of the engineering department
Yes.
or whatever department it
Uh-huh.
is, or HR or whatever. And then they actually have to interface and help with the work. And what you have there is you have a breaking down of the barriers where people misunderstand what everyone is doing. So
Mm.
everyone has this idea of everyone in sales is a complete bastard who just, they
Money
receive
and
commission in the form
cigars,
of,
right?
yeah, they only breathe because they receive commission in the form of oxygen, all this kind of stuff. And then you realize that actually a lot of salespeople are pretty decent, but they are driven by specific things like commission, because that's their personality, that's their job.
Yes.
So, and they don't have to be a bastard about it. They can do it, nicely. And if they understand how technical has to work, they're much less, and vice versa, they're much less likely to just do what we used to call a sales grenade, which is kind of, and then you have to fulfill it when it explodes in
Yes.
your lap and kind of thing.
Uh-huh.
So,
I think the great example when it comes to putting people into different departments is Zappos, because they make people. I think in some frequency they make them work in customer support, so they are literally picking up the phones, and that's where you can find out the most about the company, right? Because people
yeah,
are calling that something was broken on their shoe, so that's a technical problem. Then it
yeah,
wasn't delivered, that's a fulfillment problem, right? So you get all these different ideas from all these different departments literally just by talking to customers, and it creates
yeah.
the ideas and so on. And I mean,
And one
that's
of
the
the
key, right? You want to
Yeah,
have
yeah. And
these ideas
one of the
flowing.
first things we tell people as CEOs is, if you want to understand your culture and start changing it, cut out all of the middle management, not bypass them, but cut them out and talk to the people doing that job, the people on the ground. If you want to understand what is really happening, don't rely on the layers of intermediation, because that's when you involve politics and agendas and various other things, or misunderstandings or interpretations or whatever it is. If you want to understand a specific thing about your culture and start learning how to change it, talk to those people. And that's where you
Interesting.
get that understanding.
Okay, so let's say that you are in the company. You've already created that link, that bridge between these different departments. So right now, that's a good environment for finally starting to learning and teaching from each other,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, absolutely. And this is, I think that so I have a model for learning and teaching. I've got a number of models for learning and teaching, which I'm currently working on. And I'll talk about like the thing with, we'll come back to pedagogy, which is how kids are mostly taught in a bit. But within a company, because bureaucracy is set in specific ways, that usually means learning has specific goals. Now, one of those is very often to make profit. You know, you have a company that says, we want customers to understand our product or to learn, you know, people to learn systems or whatever. But sooner or later, somebody, because we live in a capitalist society, says, how do we monetize this? Right? And that is the single biggest problem with learning, is that well, it comes in three parts again, right? It's easier to look at a single point of authority and control than look at the requirements of each individual learner, whether this is a company or a kid's classroom or whatever it is. If you can do that, it's much easier to metricize. And if you can metricize things easily, you can profit from them. Because you can profit from metrics, right? You can set goals and tasks and key objectives and whatever else. And that, I think, is really important, because in a company, in education, in whatever else, schools very often are held accountable for scores and for various other things. And so, you know, when they're not achievable, they start gaming the system, they start demanding to make profit, and it kind of can get very complicated with things. So once you've got into a company, you say, right, let's start at the beginning. Every human interaction is a teaching and learning experience. Every single one. You have a meeting, you have an onboarding, you say hi over a coffee. It doesn't matter what it is, right? And it's a resetting of how we think about teaching and learning.
I think I was listening to a really interesting podcast today by Ray Dalio, and he was discussing it was called thoughtful disagreement, and it's basically that the most effective teams are built that they can really learn and teach from each other by discussing things that they are not like they don't agree with each other, right? And they can discuss it without an ego, and then come to a consensus which is the best for the common goal.
Absolutely, and that's actually something you do in Cynefin, or any kind of that kind of complex thing as well. You've got this idea of dissent being very important, and failure not being a bad thing, right? So when I teach people, I say there is no failure, there's only feedback. The failure comes from ignoring the feedback and repeating your mistakes constantly, right? So dissent is very important, because when you have dissent which doesn't have ego, when it's relatively safe, you're allowing people to be realistic and pull up issues that can then be dealt with, right? So, and what you're also doing there in teams is you are using distributed cognition to approach things, rather than one viewpoint which suffers from inattentional blindness and whatever. So if you take a good example of how a lot of companies work, the leader says, I don't care, I want it done this way, and you have to fulfill that. Whatever problems there might be, and they may be very good at specifically what they do, but they have inattentional blindness or a tunnel vision because they have expertise, right, in one area. Just grab my mic, which is slipping slightly. There we go. So yeah, that's a really important kind of thing. Inattentional blindness is a real thing, and it stems from expertise. So, you know, you're more likely to see it in someone who says, I've been a CEO for 30 years, you know, I've been a head teacher for 40 years or whatever, than you are from someone new who is actually quite open-minded and prepared to consider innovative ideas.
Interesting. I would like to circle back to what you said about that leader really says what needs to be done. And I think if you see successful leaders, how they may, for example, lead meetings and maybe brainstorm about interesting topics, they're usually the last ones who are presenting their topics, their ideas, right? They let the whole team come up with ideas, come up with the things relevant to brainstorming, and then they're last ones who are presenting their ideas. Because if they would present it for like as a first person, they would set the level, they would set the direction, and it would be already biased by them. And when they like let other people comment on the topic first, it actually creates a good ground for better discussion, because well, ego will be there all the time, and people don't want to piss their boss or something, or the leader for saying something which might he or she wouldn't agree. So that's, I think, a good advice, like when it comes to presenting your ideas and brainstorming.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a very good example of the split. I have a very definite split between what I call a leader who works by example and works with people to bring the best out in them, and a boss who just is command and control. I want this done, right? One of those is really good and very good for the growth of a company in the direction and the efficiency. And one of those is not so good.
Okay, so let's talk more about learning and teaching. So how can actually these different departments and different people learn and teach from each other in the best way, so there is growth in their company in a way that people are actually not used to, right? So if you go there and you make these changes, you apply your knowledge, what people actually can see after that?
So you can see a much better uptake for collaboration. You see much more willingness to learn from people, not to do a very human thing, which we've seen a lot recently, which is whatever evidence is presented, if it goes against your personal narrative, you will double down and say, no, that's just not correct. Even if it's, every scientist on earth is saying it, you'll still say that. It makes you more open to actually learning, right? And this is one of the keys. We have been, if you follow this, we've been taught how to learn very badly.
Yes.
Right? We've been taught that
yes,
in school, children should be seen and not heard. This goes back to Victorian times and pedagogy. Right? So pedagogy is really interesting. It comes from the Greek, which originally meant leading boys. It's kind of now means teaching children. And pedagogy is the idea that children should be lectured to, they should sit, they shouldn't play, they should be taught how to do specific things. And it's all very classroom rigid, and it's a terrible, and like no human learns well like that.
And interesting that
now
it hasn't changed much, right?
Well, it hasn't changed much, no. And so one of the reasons for that is in 1970 something, a guy called Martin Knowles looked at teaching and learning, and he looked at pedagogy, and he did it all of us a massive disservice. And he said, okay, well, this has always been like this, so it's probably fine. Now, that's part of the reason that business is in so much trouble at the moment, right? Just because something's traditional, it's always been done that way, it doesn't mean it's the best way.
Yes.
The same way that the newest iPhone isn't necessarily the new best phone,
yes.
right? So, and that goes back to Taylorism and how bureaucracy was created in factories. And so that's how people do it. So it must be done that way. And that's why there are so many bad management practices and various other things. And with teaching, he kind of left pedagogy alone, but he created this new thing called andragogy, which is, the leading of men. It's the teaching of adults. So that's where you have this idea in companies now of, we learn through play. So we're all going to come in a room and take off our shoes and throw a ball to each other and do it. And I'm like, so hang on, what you're saying is, when you get to that, we taught you wrong as a kid as a joke. You should actually be learning like this. Like, that doesn't make any sense, right? All humans learn in a very specific way. When you start looking at the neuroscience of it, everything that you learn is essentially creating neural connections within your brain.
Yes.
Right? So if that happens within your motor cortex, that's what we call muscle memory. If that happens elsewhere, you're looking at memory and retention and understanding and whatever. And we find neurons in specific patterns. So we've got about 2 to 3 gigabytes of storage within our brain as a lump of fat, which is, it's pretty pathetic. It's like single layer DVD, it's terrible. But because we structure things in how we fire neurons in patterns, it's actually about 2 petabytes, which is pretty big. Right? So humans are quite fascinating in how we use our cognition. And before we're even born, we are creating neural connections based on stimulus. Simple as that. This is called neuroplasticity, right? Kids have much better neuroplasticity than adults. So we're taking these people with very high neuroplasticity and saying, do nothing except listen to what I'm telling you on a blackboard or whatever. And then you go to adults and say, you need to play and have fun and learn. Like, kids need that more because children lack several things that adults have. And one of them is an understanding of abstract concepts. If you go on a course now and the teacher is rubbish, you say, that teacher was pretty shit, because you have an understanding of what teaching should be for good or bad. A child doesn't know that. They just don't like the lesson or whatever it is. but they also don't have life experience. So number one, telling stories, i.e. using narrative, is vital because stories can give you context that you don't have yourself, and pseudo experimentation or pseudo experience, right, from someone else. You know, this man flew into the sun, Icarus on his wings. He, the wax melted, he plummeted to his death. And the kid's like, okay, I haven't personally done that, but I can see why that's a bad thing. So stories are really, really important for that kind of thing. And then you've also got the idea of experimentation, because children learn best by playing and experimenting. All humans do. So this comes on to something I've been creating called homagogy, which is what I use when I talk to companies. It's what I use when I talk to people at universities. It's kind of so coming from the Greek again, homagogy means the teaching of humans, because we all learn the same way. So my basis for this, and the model I've been building, is you learn through creating neural connections, and all humans do that. All humans, whether you're unborn, whether you're ancient, it doesn't matter. The level of it may change from neuroplasticity, but that's how we learn. But then we look at how you engage that learning, and that is key, that's critical, right? And there are two areas of engagement that are super important, and this will change depending on the company I'm teaching in, or the academia, or the country I'm teaching in, or whatever, right? So one of those is cultural. You have to engage people at a cultural level, because cultures are different, they have different traditions, and also languages are totally different because they frame how you think. So you're Dutch, right?
No, I'm from Czech Republic.
Are you Czech Republic? I thought you were Dutch. Okay, so I like to take Dutch as a good example, because Dutch is a crazy language.
It is.
I mean, English is a crazy language as well. Dutch is a crazy language. So if you want another cup of coffee in English, and I don't know how you'd say it in Czech, so I'm not even going to try, but in English, obviously, it's, can I have another large cup of coffee, please? Or please, can I have another? It's fairly logical. Similar in German, even Japanese is relatively structured like this, and so on. And then in Dutch, you have something like nog een groot kopje koffie graag, which means another little big cup of coffee gladly. It's just a very different way of saying things. So culturally, you will have slightly different ideas of humor from me. You will think about things differently because your language is structured differently, and so on. So to teach people effectively, you have to be able to engage them. And I've taught quite a lot of people from Middle and Eastern Europe, and it's totally different to America, totally different to France, totally different to India. So that's one part of engagement you have to.
So do you actually start by understanding the culture when you go to a company in a foreign country?
You have to understand some of it, and so now ethnography.
Again, it's a first step, right? Gather the context where the company is culturally.
Exactly, and part of that comes, you can't just immediately walk into a lesson or a class or a workshop or whatever and suddenly be like, I interface with you and you are learning. You actually have to know the people, a little bit about the culture, a little bit about whatever. So, there's kind of a bedding in period when you start interfacing with people. They have to want to trust you and learn from you and connect with you and all of this kind of thing as well. And the second area, of course, that leads on to this, it's not just cultural, it's also individual, because people have different upbringings, they've been to different schools, they have different families. Neurodiversity is very important. If somebody has autistic traits, they will learn in a totally different way and be engaged in a totally different way, even though they're still just making neural connections, because they process things differently. So that's very interesting. When you look at how companies do this active play learning, if somebody is really introverted or has some types of autistic traits, you're going to find that they don't engage at all, because it's terrifying to be told you are going to come in this group and stand in the middle and talk to people. And a lot of people don't think about that. So those are the three areas. You've got your neural connections, your cultural and your individual engagement. Once you bring that together, you start being able to learn a little bit better. It wasn't a simple answer.
Well, if you want to teach a group of people, but everybody has a different background, everybody has a different character traits, how can you actually structure the program to fit to everybody if you're teaching, I don't know, 10, 20, 50 people?
So that's when you start looking at things in a much more emergent fashion. And this is a good part of complexity theory, right? Instead of saying, I have a goal, I have a plan, and I will reach that whatever, that can be beneficial. But if you don't have the context, you don't have the understanding, or you just cannot close the gap between those two scenarios, where you are and what this is, because of reality or something gets in the way, or the class composition, whatever it is, you have to be able to reactively and emergently change goals and move in different ways. So every single class is different for me. And I, by the way, am not in charge of a class. I've never been in charge of a class. I say, the first thing I say to people is, every class I run, I learn something new too. So
Yes.
I'm a student here as well. We're all equal. I like people to sit around a table. I don't like classroom style. And I get people collaborating and talking, because we learn most effectively when we learn together. Something I said on my TEDx talk was, you know, when you're collaborating with other people, they ask the questions that you haven't thought of about something, so you will learn more effectively. Their questions fill the gaps in your knowledge, essentially.
I would like to challenge you on a thing you said a couple minutes back, which is that we learned best by playing and experimenting.
Yeah.
But I heard that we learned best by teaching, actually, other people, right?
We do. We absolutely do. So when, okay, so let's kind of split those out slightly. In terms of how humans work, the experimentation and the play and using narrative is the engagement method that we learn best. But the delivery method, or the method of learning best, is through teaching. So there was a study done by University of Leicester, 10 years ago, it must be now. And they listed out the different types of teaching and the level of retention of information that came from them.
Yes.
And the worst, it was 5%, was university lectures or lectures.
Yes, I saw
general,
that study.
Terrible.
It's interesting.
But the top of that was teaching. So you learn, I base a lot of what I do on the old thing from Confucius, because I like it, right? Tell me and I will forget, show me and I may remember, involve me and I will understand.
Yes.
When you teach someone else, you are experimenting on the fly, because you are having to break down concepts for yourself before you can give them to someone else.
Yes.
Right? So you are kind of real-time experimenting and using narrative, because then people say, well, how does that work? And you have to think of examples to put this. So you are actually experimenting and using narrative when you are teaching people, if you aren't just teaching people as knowledge transfer by reading something off a bit of paper, which isn't really teaching.
There's
Teaching
really
is
no
about
added value.
inspiration.
So interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so one of my last questions, we're not talking very nice about current school and educational system, but I would like you to give me some ideas. How do you think that schools in the future should look like, and if they already are doing it somewhere, maybe in Scandinavia, what are the common traits?
So Scandinavia are definitely doing it, and I think what you said is really important. It's the system, not the teachers, right? There are a huge amount of very good teachers out there who are very frustrated because they're told, you know, they know how they should be teaching. What I'm doing, although I'm adding pieces to models for learning, it's not, you know, totally brand new. I mean, I call it the neo-paleo cognitive diet, because it's ancient and it's new, right? So we kind of know how we need to teach, or teachers know how they should be teaching, but they're told, you need to obtain these metrics, you need to do it in this way because the curriculum demands it. So the first, or one of the most important, maybe not the first steps, is going to be changing at a fundamental level how we approach the idea of teaching and learning. So not focusing on the teaching in terms of profit and control, but focusing on the learning in terms of enabling students. And that, you have to bring in this idea of somebody must be interested, then they must be inspired, then they must be involved, immersed, invested, and then they will automatically start instructing. It's like a circular model that I've been working on.
Yes.
And teachers know how to do that. We do it naturally. Curriculums stop you doing that, and that's a problem. So we need to address that first, I think. Scandinavia do it very well. Finland was the example, right? they give teachers and pupils time to go and learn what they want to learn with no homework, no forced, set limitations.
I know that in Denmark, in universities, you can literally just take one semester and work on your project, and build your startup or your company, which is amazing. Like, I mean, you will learn this way. You will learn way more than just reading through scripts.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. But if you want to translate that into business as well, look at what Google do, which is where they give you, I think it's 20% of your time to work on your own projects,
Yes.
which makes you more productive at
Yes.
doing your own work, right? So because when you're learning efficiently and you're taking all this learning in, like we never stop learning until we die. We say old dogs can't learn new tricks, and that's bullshit. They can, they just don't want to. You learn all the way through. So being freed to learn properly in line with how we should be learning allows you to actually integrate everything that you know. And this is where, you bring in comfort zone models and all sorts of other things. And I think that's important as well. Being comfortable to move outside, comfortable enough to move outside your comfort zone to your optimum performance and growth and learning, but not too far so that you're panicking or anxious or whatever is really important. And companies providing that psychological safety and that, ability to learn, schools saying to children, you need to have this amount of time to go and learn, to focus on your projects. The semester thing for the Danish university, that's fantastic because it lets people focus in their own time and do it in their own way rather than forcing them to something that maybe doesn't suit them, maybe isn't in their context.
And you gave a great example with Google. I think especially for engineers and IT people, it's incredibly beneficial when they can invest the knowledge they gained in the company, like about some new technology, and then apply it immediately in their own project. It's really win-win for everybody involved.
Yeah, absolutely. And this also goes through into other cultural shifts in terms of the amount of time you spend at work, because the daily 9-to-5 grind was actually put in place to stop child labor and various other things. And now in a 24/7 world, it's kind of actually limiting and quite damaging, and it's grinding people down. And so I've burned out twice as a result of this and various other things. So when you start looking at that and how you can structure your own learning around your own time boxes as well, your own schedules, you find that people would rather dedicate focus over a few days and then take time off to recover than work 9-to-5 steadily grinding away at, so it's very fluid. I think there are a number of different things that we can do, and it will all depend on the individual context of where we're applying them, right?
Chris, I always like to wrap up these interviews on something very actionable, but since we've been talking about so many different things, I really cannot wrap my head around that. So, look, Chris, what is the number one thing you would like to, number one tip you would like to give a person who is maybe leading a team, who's leading an organization, and want to do it in maybe a little more modern fashion?
So I would say, be aware that failure is key to learning and success, and that every human interaction is learning. So don't discount things. Don't try to force them to be incredibly rigid. You can actually, in a very ecosystemic way, allow learning to help, invest people in your company, to help invest people in your leadership. And if you kind of work in that way, where you become a learning organization, and everyone is quite aligned without being forced to be aligned, they have come together to be aligned to deliver whatever you're delivering. You're starting to focus more on the outcomes rather than the structure that's been built within the company.
Yes.
And that's the key point, is think about the people, because all of this comes from people. If you remove the people from a company, there is no company, right? And there is no failure, there's only feedback. So those are my kind of pointers to leaders who want to learn. Amazing
advice. Chris, if people want to learn more about you, maybe they want to hire you, they don't want to do it themselves, where are the best places to connect with you or get in touch with you?
So probably LinkedIn is one of the best. I get a lot through word of mouth. You can also go to involvemetraining.com, where I've got a blog with a lot of this stuff if you have trouble sleeping, and other things. You can also have a look at my TEDx, which is, I'm
Yes.
sure I can give you a link or something, which goes through some of these things and allows you to look at it. So I have a channel called The Gentle Iconoclast on YouTube, where I break down some of these things, because they are quite, non-traditional, a lot of these ideas.
That's true.
And yeah, I'm always open to an email or whatever. And just, so I don't work on a way that I turn up like a white knight in shining armor for a company. I go in on an engagement basis to help a company discover this for themselves, because that's how they're going to learn it,
Yes.
right? And then I leave when they've learned it, and they just continue to grow and expand. So it's not really my work. I'm enabling them and inspiring them to do it themselves, which is what a teacher should be doing, really.
And I think coach as well, you already have all the answers you need, right? And coach and teacher should just enable them and help you to identify all these things that you might be asking.
Absolutely.
Great. Chris, so thank you very much, guys. If you want to learn more about Chris, just go to his LinkedIn. You can find his TEDx speech there, his YouTube channel, and all the contacts he mentions, his email and so on. And please, if he brought you some value, just share with your friends. You can either share the link if you're watching this on YouTube, or you can just take a screenshot of the Spotify or iTunes whenever you're listening this podcast on, and share with your friends, because Chris shared some amazing value here, some golden nuggets, and I think some other people can very much benefit from it as well. So Chris, thanks a lot for coming to my show.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.